Al-Malaki, heading an economical committee, says that we seek to enter a third mobile operator to achieve competition and better service. UN Security Council adopts a decision about humanitarian aid to Syria. Al-Jafari calls the ones who are keen on the humanitarian situation to lift the unfair sanctions and help the Syrian government in fighting terrorism. And the Iranian foreign minister stresses the necessity to fight terrorism and extremism, which have become an obsession for the people in the region. Good afternoon. This is the News Bulletin. I'm Dania Nizam. Deputy Prime Minister Foreign and Expatriate Minister Walid Al-Muallim received today the UNRWA Commissioner Filippo Grandi. Al-Muallim asserted that the challenges and difficulties facing the UNRWA in Syria are due to the armed terrorist group's acts of terrorism in the Palestinian refugees camps. Foreign Minister Al-Muallim renewed the Syrian government's keenness to continue hosting the Palestinian refugees until they gain their right of return to their homeland in Palestine, stressing on the necessity to neutralize the Palestinian refugees from what is happening in Syria. The General Commissioner for the UNRWA hailed the fruitful cooperation and the efforts being exerted by the Syrian government to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian refugees and overcome the challenges and difficulties that are facing the UNRWA's work in Syria. Syria's permanent representative to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar Jafari, said the Syrian government has worked since the onset of the crisis to improve the humanitarian situation in Syria, placing the humanitarian issue at the top of its priorities and working day and night to meet all the citizens' humanitarian needs in parallel with restoring security and stability to the country. Al-Jafari asserted that the Syrian government is committed to its international obligations, including its obligations with the UN and its organizations, as per the General Assembly Resolution number 46/182, which calls for respecting the country's sovereignty. And in this context, and as part of implementing the presidential statement of the Security Council dated October 2nd, 2003, the government took a series of administrative and logistical steps that enabled the UN and humanitarian organizations to expand their activities, something which couldn't have happened without the government's cooperation as a full partner. He cited as an example of these procedures the agreement to open a third air bridge to deliver humanitarian aid from Erbil in Iraq to Qamishli in Syria, allowing for 11 flights to deliver aid, while the first and second bridges allowed for 13 and 10 flights respectively, adding that the government offered the use of its own aerial fleet for these flights as a sign of good intentions. Al-Jafari said that the Syrian government is shouldering the greatest burden in terms of food aid distributed in Syria at around 75% of this aid, while the UN and other organizations provide only around 25%. Al-Jafari asserted that the campaign of escalating statements and slandering meetings launched by the countries which support terrorism by funding and arming were accompanied by blatant and crude encouragement and incitement of the terrorist groups that do their bidding to do all they can to prevent and hinder Syrian citizens from earning their livelihoods and sustenance and drown them in darkness, injustice and suffering. Al-Jafari asserted that the Syrian government has always welcomed any honest effort to improve the humanitarian conditions in Syria and cooperated positively with the UN, in addition to welcoming the aforementioned presidential statement and committing to it. Al-Jafari underlined the activities carried out by terrorist groups, including some affiliated to Al-Qaeda, with these groups methodically seeking to destroy the infrastructure and deplete the country's resources, in addition to deliberate attacks on aid convoys and humanitarian workers, several of whom were killed, in addition to attacking and besieging areas and preventing civilians in them from receiving any aid, and using civilians as human shields to prevent the army and security forces from acting against terrorism. He asserted that the Syrian government is exercising its right and constitutional duty of combating terrorism, which is striking Syria indiscriminately, and that this right is based on international law and Security Council resolution, adding that passing and enforcing laws is at the core of the authority of the state, including laws for confronting terrorist activities within its territories, and no one can deny the state's exclusive duty and right to this. Al-Jafari added that another aspect is the lack of humanitarian funding, as the 2014 humanitarian response plan's funding didn't exceed 7% of the required funding, despite the showboating carried out in conferences here and there, with funding presented to the regional response plan for Syrian refugees failing to exceed 13%. Al-Jafari asserted that the claims of the French representative during this session, in which he alleged that the Syrian security arrested people who turned themselves in as per reconciliations, are completely incorrect. Al-Jafari pointed out that the Security Council's presidential statement, which Syria committed itself to, constitutes the basis for much of the resolution issued today, and that this statement affirmed clearly that there is international terrorism in Syria carried out by groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda, adding that this came after unjustifiable and inexplicable denial of this terrorism's existence. Al-Jafari said that suggesting that the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of Syrians can be solved by merely allowing humanitarian operations across borders with neighboring countries which are involved in escalating the humanitarian situation in Syria and supporting arming, training and funding terrorist groups, including the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Islamic State and others, is mere misdirection and is not like a magic wand story, asserting that these very same borders are responsible for bringing terrorism to Syria and causing bloodshed in it. He said that violence has reached an illogical and uncanny point in Syria, but the most important question is, why is this happening, and what is the cause of the unjustifiable silence over all the vulgar forms of foreign interference in Syria's internal affairs? Al-Jafari suggested that the reason behind that is the prevailing mentality among some sides is that diplomacy of the hyenas and not the diplomacy of international human law.
تماما كما قالت زميلتي العزيزة سفيرة الأرجنتين.
Russian Foreign Ministry said that it has voted in favor of the International Security Council resolution on providing humanitarian assistance to Syria, taking into consideration the Russian amendments, asserting that the resolution doesn't include threats of imposing sanctions. Spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Alexander Lukashevich, said that the main goal of this resolution is improving the humanitarian situation in Syria and guaranteeing the delivery of assistance to the civilians. And it asserts the necessity of providing assistance to Syria in accordance to the rules of the United Nations, and that means respecting Syria's sovereignty. In turn, Russia's permanent representative in the UN, Vitaly Churkin, said that there are attempts to exploit the humanitarian situation in Syria and that it is necessary for all parties to cooperate with international organizations and with the Syrian government. In a Security Council session, Churkin said that there are still some difficulties in delivering the assistance to the areas controlled by the armed men who shoot gunfire at the aid convoys and use the civilians as human shields. Churkin added that the opposition's activities aim at undermining the delivery of the humanitarian assistance, and they should be condemned. Churkin emphasized that the opposition should assume their responsibilities and work on eradicating terrorism, as they should cooperate with the Syrian government for this reason. The Belgian Foreign Minister stressed that Iran has an important role in the regional and international issues, particularly in the Syrian crisis, as it should officially participate in solving it. In a press conference with his Iranian counterpart, Mohammad Jawad Zarif, the latter said that extremism and terrorism has become an obsession to the people in the region, as we should work together to fight terrorism and end this phenomenon on an international level. With unflinching determination and undeterred by conspiracies and terrorism, the Syrian people continue to pour into the streets of cities and towns to show undiminishing support for the Syrian army and the national firm principles. Thousands of citizens gathered in Dahiyat al-Assad in Harassa to express support to the Syrian army, chanting slogans that express commitment to the homeland's principles and allegiance to the blood of martyrs.
I want to thank God for this day, to precipitate this public reunion, to say in this place from Dahiyat al-Assad, to say to everybody, we are going to Duma, we are going to Al-Ghouta, we are going there to make peace, to make reconciliation also. We are a people of reconciliation. We are 10,000 years old, this place. Reconciliation will start from Syria to all the world. What is going now to give us experience to be ready to every big problem will be our problem we face together with reconciliation.
المسيرات الشعبية المسيرات العفوية.
The daily popular rallies in Damascus countryside would bring the crisis closer to its end and accelerate the reconciliation's effort through creating an atmosphere of security. We came out in mass rallies despite of the terrorist shells and terrorism. We are steadfast. We rally to tell the states supporting terrorism that Syria is fighting all forms of terrorism. I am from Aleppo city. I came to Al-Dahiya to support the Syrian Arab army, as my brother died fighting Al-Qaeda armed terrorist group.
Our message is to salute the Syrian Arab Army as we came here to celebrate the Army's glories. We gather in Al-Dahiya today to support the Syrian Arab Army in its fight against the armed terrorist groups.
And my message is that victory is imminent, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching. After the break, it's Vani with our economic and business news. God bless you all. Syria. The General Commissioner for the UNRWA hailed the fruitful cooperation and the efforts being exerted by the Syrian government to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian refugees and overcome the challenges and difficulties that are facing the UNRWA's work in Syria. Syria's permanent representative to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar Jafari, said the Syrian government has worked since the onset of the crisis to improve humanitarian situation in Syrian aid to Syria. Al-Jafari calls the ones who are keen on the humanitarian situation to lift the unfair sanctions and help the Syrian government in fighting terrorism. And the Iranian foreign minister stresses the necessity to fight terrorism and extremism, which have become an obsession for the people. Al-Muallim received today the UNRWA Commissioner Filippo Grandi. Al-Muallim asserted that the challenges and difficulties facing the UNRWA in Syria are due to the armed terrorist group's acts of terrorism in the Palestinian refugees camps. Foreign Minister Al-Muallim renewed the Syrian government's keenness to continue hosting the Palestinian refugees until they gain their right of return to their homeland in Palestine, stressing on the necessity to neutralize the Palestinian refugees from what is happening in Al-Halaqi, heading an economical committee, says that we seek to enter a third mobile operator to achieve competition and better service. UN Security Council adopts a decision about humanity in the region. Good afternoon. This is the News Bulletin. I'm Dania Nizam. Deputy Prime Minister Foreign and Expatriate Minister Walid al